A group of priests, relentless and cold, cut her hair with bronze blades, tearing away the long black strands that had, until then, represented her identity, her beauty, and her connection to her family. The coldness of the blade was a harbinger of a life that would never be the same. Her father, a humble worker, had brought her to the temple 3 days earlier. He was in debt, unable to pay with grain or silver, and as payment he had given his daughter to the temple, a cruel and irrevocable trade. Nefertari, with her innocent eyes, didn't fully understand what was happening. But her father told her that she should feel honored to serve the gods, that it was a noble choice. God will choose you for great deeds, he said, trying to offer her some comfort. But as the bronze touched her head, tearing her hair forcefully, the tears began to roll uncontrollably. In the oppressive silence of the temple, an older priestess, unyielding in her discipline, approached and slapped her, saying harshly, "The servants of God do not cry. You no longer have a name, nor tears. You belong to Ammon, and Ammon does not tolerate weakness." These words resonated like a sentence. From that moment on, Nefertari would no longer be her father's daughter. She would become a servant of the temple, with no identity, no right to choose, and no freedom. Nefertari's life from then on was marked by silence and control. She was taken to live within the imposing stone walls of the temple, a place seemingly sacred, but where life became a cycle of servitude. She would never marry, would never know freedom, and would never again have the right to decide her own body or future. She would become one of the thousands of girls and women who, over the centuries, lived and died within these temples, dressed in purity, but trapped in servitude. Her body, once free, was now marked by the ownership of the gods. This story, which might seem like a distant echo from a forgotten past, is not unique. Nefertari was one of many young girls who, from an early age, were given to the temple to serve the gods. Many parents, crushed by poverty and fear, saw this sacrifice as a way to gain divine favor or to alleviate their burden. The children, many of them unaware of what awaited them, were handed over to this system that removed them from their families and separated them from their previous lives. The temple, which should have been a place of devotion, became, in reality, a center of power, control, and exploitation. The Egyptian term for these women was Hemet, meaning servant of God or wife of God. But what these designations hid was a bitter reality. They were the property of the gods, and, through the strict control of the priests, were deprived of their autonomy, their identity, and often their dignity. The meaning of purity in the context of the temple was not chastity, but ritual purity, imposed by rigid rules that controlled every aspect of their lives, from their movements to their personal relationships. The women brought to the temple were often still children, unaware of what awaited them. They were forced to undergo a purification process, beginning with the cutting of their hair, followed by the imposition of a new name that erased their former identity and connected them to the divine. The purity they were to maintain was not of spirit, but of body and function, subordinating them completely to the will of the priests. But the true cruelty of the system lay in how the girls were trained to accept this life as their only truth. They were separated from their families and identities, forced to accept that their bodies were temples of the gods, but, in reality, they were treated as mere tools of power. Many of these girls were taken as payment for debts, like Nefertari, or were given by their parents, who saw it as a way to guarantee survival. But most of them never returned home. Inside the temple, the women were isolated and controlled. Their education was not aimed at preparing them for life outside the temple, but for a life of eternal servitude. Family ties, moments of human connection, were severed and silenced. The work they performed was monotonous and grueling. But the hardest to endure was not just the physical labor, but the relentless silence that surrounded them. They were forbidden to speak, to interact with others, unless it was a direct order from the priests. Any form of resistance, no matter how subtle, was harshly punished. Life became an existence without personal meaning, without autonomy, purely dedicated to keeping the temple functioning. Resistance within the temple, however, was not completely extinguished. Amidst this suffering, some women found ways to resist, to preserve a part of their identity. For example, some carved secret messages into the temple's stone's words of resistance, reminders of their lives before servitude, as a final cry for freedom. The inscriptions were simple, but filled with meaning. I was free, they took this from me, deliver us, O God. Nefertari, who never imagined such a fate, had to submit to all the purification rituals and subjugation imposed by the temple. Her identity was erased with the cutting of her hair, her life rewritten when her name was changed. She became Nefert Nevit, the beautiful lady, a name given by the priests, who, in some way, believed they had the right to rewrite even a person's essence. But even under this weight, she still resisted internally. This story is not a legend, but a dark reality that endures through the pages of history. The exploitation of young women within Egyptian temples, disguised as religious devotion, was a practice that lasted for centuries, with women being seen as possessions of the gods and treated as commodities. They were seen as purities for the gods, but their lives were far from pure. They were, in fact, victims of a system that used them and then discarded them, often erasing their names from history. Today, Egypt's temples remain as monuments to the grandeur of an ancient civilization. But few know the true story behind these walls. Women like Nefertari, Mutimuja, and many others, whose names and stories were buried, represent the darkest and most forgotten side of an era that is otherwise celebrated for its achievements and its faith. Yet the truth remains alive, whispering through the stones, waiting to be heard by those who have the courage to listen.